Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Wellness TV. My name is John Bredenberg. I am a dietitian and diabetes care and education specialist with UF Health Jacksonville. I thank everyone for tuning in today. I know we've got some new folks out there in the audience tuning in. So again, welcome. We're trying to offer a variety of programs to kind of help keep you educated, keep you informed, and have a little bit of fun too. So today we're talking about sugar. Many of us tuning in probably already know the two most important things about sugar. And first thing, it makes food taste awesome. We already know that. And then the second thing, and the less exciting part of it, is that we tend to eat too much of it. So today what I want to do is kind of take you a tour of your sugar bowl, talk a little bit more about what it actually is, where we find it in all our different foods, but also more importantly, give you some tips to, break that sugar habit if you're someone who is tempted and allured by the power of sugar. Because it can be very powerful. I mean, I don't know if you ever even tried to give someone sweet tea before and accidentally give them unsweet tea. They may want to fight you. So it can be very powerful. So we look to sugar to do a lot of things for our diets, but it's important to understand what some healthy limits are for sugar, but also give you some information to kind of help you slowly and gradually wean yourself off any self-proclaimed sugar habits. So I'm going to get out of the way and share the rest of my slides here. Just like before, at the very end, I'll have details of how to get your wellness credit as well as copies of this slide. Use the chat function to ask any questions. I won't be able to answer them as they come in, but at the very end, I'll have plenty of time to answer questions. So if you think of something, want to type it in the chat, send it my way, and we'll be glad to get those questions answered. So what I want to make sure we cover today is understand a little bit more about the structure and metabolism of sugar, look at some of the more common places we find it, look at some of the various guidelines about sugar intake, because there's different guidelines for different governing bodies when we look at what the American Heart Association recommends for healthy diets, as well as what the dietary guidelines recommend. So we're going to look at some of these guidelines, but also show you how to convert some of those numbers. So when you look at food labels, you can relate what that particular product is in relationship to what the rest of your day might contain. And again, just like before, we want to try to make sure you leave here with some practical steps to help you make healthier and more nutritious choices for you and your family. And I feel like I would be doing myself a disservice and you a disservice if I didn't show off my Def Leppard t-shirt for Pour Some Sugar on Me. So I figured this is the perfect segue in which to do that. So when we look at what sugar is, it's important to understand that your body runs on sugar. That's our primary fuel source. So when I hear people say, well, I don't eat bananas because they turn to sugar. Well, we want that. We want that sugar. We need that fuel. But just like any other food type item, we just don't want to get too much of it. So our body runs on sugar, and primarily that sugar is also known as glucose. So what I have listed here, just a variety of different types of sugars. Typically, you'll see that OSC at the very end of the term, let you know that that is a sugar. Glucose, also known as blood sugar, but we also find it in raw state in fruits, vegetables, grains. Sucrose would be our typical table sugar, but it's again obtained from sugar cane, sugar beets, and then you see the various other types: fructose, lactose, maltose, dextrose. And each one of these is either a monosaccharide or a disaccharide. So it's not necessarily to go into all the basic biochemistry of it, but fundamentally what happens in order to get the energy from the food that we're eating, all these individual sugars are broken down into that one fundamental unit of energy called glucose. Now, when we consume foods that contain glucose, that gives us energy. If we're consuming more food than we need, that energy is put away. As many of you know, it's either stored in the muscles for later use in the liver, or unfortunately as fat too. So when we look at what sugars are a type of carbohydrate that the body is going to use for energy. It'll package a lot of that energy in that later use, like I said, in the muscles and in the liver as glycogen, which is what you see right there. So that's also what we call starch. So you find that in potatoes, rice, wheat. Dextrose is basically almost identical to glucose, derived from corn, but we also find it in fruit and honey. And then for those of you on the clinical side, you know it's an important constituent for IV fluid. So again, just a little introduction to the basic types of sugar out there. But when we take a closer look at the one that gets the most attention, at least in nutrition and in our food supply, it's table sugar. So table sugar, another word for it, as we showed before, is sucrose. It's a combination of two different sugar molecules, glucose and fructose. Incidentally, that's the same combination that we see when we compare sucrose to high fructose corn syrup, which is also a combination of glucose and fructose. I share the chemical formula, not because there's going to be any kind of trivia question about it, but it's important to understand that when people tell me that, I try to make sure I'm making healthier choices for my family, so I'm trying to avoid all those chemicals. Well, this is the one chemical that really needs the most attention. So it's important to understand that sugar is a chemical. It doesn't make it harmful, but it's the one that needs the most attention when we're trying to make healthier choices for our family. We know where we get sugar from, extracted from sugar cane and sugar beets, but when we look at labels, when we look at foods, it's just one of many types of sugar in our food supply. When I say many, there might be 50 different types. I've got 30 or so listed on your screen. So you've got anything from molasses to powdered sugar to turbinado sugar to corn syrup to honey to agave nectar, brown, all of these are variations on the same theme. They're all different types of sugar. Ounce per ounce typically provide the same amount of calories per gram. And more importantly, when we look at all of these individual sugars and try to make comparisons from one to another, there really isn't one that's a better choice. Yes, certain types of sugar might have better applications in different types of recipes or using them in beverages or flavor or texture, but to argue that one type of sweetener is quote unquote better than another just tends to lose sight of the big picture, and that is they all provide the same amount of calories and they all provide either none or very, very minimal amounts of additional nutrients. So when we look at all the different types of sugar in our food supply, there's a lot of them out there, and there really isn't one that I would rank as being preferential over another when we talk about trying to build a nutritious and well-balanced diet. Now, what happens when we eat sugar? We already know it tastes awesome. What happens in our body? So our body, as I said, needs to break everything down into a usable form of energy. So whenever we eat a carbohydrate-rich food, so remember, sugar is a type of carbohydrate. Whenever we eat it, that signals the release of insulin. Our body's going to break it down into glucose, which will signal the pancreas to release additional insulin. What the insulin was doing or will do is help that glucose enter the cells. So once that occurs, once it is entering the cells and getting that immediate energy need met, let's say you're going to a workout and you need a little bit of energy. Once that immediate energy need is met, the additional glucose is going into glycogen storage, so that's packaged in the liver or the muscles, or that additional glucose will be converted to fat for storage there too. The other thing that insulin is doing, amidst all these other processes of promoting fat and glycogen storage, it also signals the body to stop burning its own fat. So when we look at repeated consumption of sugar, you can see how it could easily lead to additional weight gain because of all the different processes that it's signaling in the body. Those elevated insulin levels from having too much glucose could also signal hunger later on too. So this is where we see appetite signals are sometimes blunted from over-consuming carbohydrate, not just simple sugars, but carbohydrates in general. Now, when we look at it and take it a step further, a lot of people say, oh, I've got a sweet tooth, or I just can't get enough sugar. That's because it has very powerful influences on our brain. The brain is a pretty greedy user of sugar. About half of the sugar energy is used up by our brains. We already know that sweet foods are more pleasurable. All right, this is something that we have evolved to recognize, that anything that tastes sweet is desirable. It's a good source of energy. The body wants it. What happens is it activates dopamine and helps to reinforce that behavior. So we're conditioning ourselves to know that, hey, that glazed donut tastes incredible. I want it again. And repeated activation of that pathway, getting that dopamine release, also leads to tolerance. So it almost gets to a point where we're tolerating that sweet item, so we need a little bit more to get that same pleasurable feeling. So this can drive a stronger craving. Now, people will argue that sugar can be just as addictive as cocaine and heroin. I'm not so sure that's a good analogy that I would make. I mean, no one's going to jail or becoming homeless because of too much sugar, but you can see how influencing that dopamine release can be very tough to overcome, and it can change how we desire certain types of food. It's not as powerfully addictive as some of those illicit drugs, but it can have some of those same impacts. And what we see is that when that sugar intake is reduced, so if you're someone that is, always allured to donuts and cupcakes and things like that, as you start to titrate that amount down, taking less and less, those cravings start to diminish, and your brain can adapt, meaning it's going to want a little bit less when exposed. So if you're somebody that really is consuming a lot of sugar, and we'll look at what those amounts are in a few moments, as you start to cut back, the next time you're exposed to something very sweet, you may not need as much. And that's important to understand, because when we look at some of these sugar cravings, they can be managed, but it comes at a cost, and the cost is just a little bit less exposure over a gradual period of time. And we'll talk about some strategies to kind of help you navigate through that pathway. So let's look at quantities and what's recommended, in terms of too much, how much sugar is too much. And when I say too much, I'm talking about the added types of sugar. I'm not talking about the natural types of sugar that we find in fruits and vegetables and grain products and milk products, but we're talking about added sugar. And we've covered this before in other webinars, but the American Heart Association is suggesting we limit our added sugar intake anywhere from 6 to 9 teaspoons a day. So if you figure there's about 4 grams of sugar per teaspoon, you can see what that converts to on your screen. For children, anywhere from 3 to 6 teaspoons per day. So these are daily limits for optimal health over the course of the day. The American Academy of Pediatrics, if we dig a little bit deeper and look at what's advised for children, actually doesn't recommend any added sugar in a child's diet up until the age of 2. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at, trying to build a healthful diet from our family. So that's the American Heart Association. The dietary guidelines for Americans have a little bit different spin on it. Again, each of these are coming from different angles in terms of what they're trying to promote. Dietary guidelines also has a lot of industry influence in it. I'm not saying that makes it bad, but you can see where the guidelines would be a little bit more liberal in this case. And the guidelines for dietary guidelines suggest no more than 10% of the total calories should come from added sugar. So they're really looking at it from your overall caloric intake, which is actually pretty smart, because, 6 teaspoons and 9 teaspoons, those are absolute amounts. It doesn't really take into account for people who may need more energy because they're doing more activity. But if we looked at some of the numbers there, and I give you an example, 1,800 calories, that would mean, okay, no more than 180 calories coming from added sugar. 4 calories per gram, that's how much we know as far as the conversion there, would mean 45 grams of or less from added sugar. So those are the numbers. That's what's suggested, that's what's recommended for health and well-being. If we look at that and try to convert that to practical terms, 38 grams, 25 grams, 25 grams, 45 grams. If you were to have 1 can of regular soda, you're already going over and above what's recommended by the American Heart Association and coming very close to what's recommended for the dietary guidelines based on what your recommended caloric intake is. So it can add up very quickly when we look at where we find sugar in concentrated amounts. And the good news is, we already know, we came into this knowing that, all right, well, we are eating a little bit too much sugar. That's not a shock. The good news is we're actually taking in less. All right, so that amount of sugar that we're consuming as a country is decreasing, but we're still getting well above what's suggested, almost double in some instances, about 17 teaspoons per day. So although our sugar intake is gradually coming down, if we look at the trends, it's still way above what's suggested. And actually, the United States is estimated to be the leading country in terms of per capita added sugar consumption overall. So that's not something that we want to be too proud of. But fortunately, we now have a revised food label that helps us find added sugar a lot easier. It used to be you wouldn't really know the difference between added sugar and natural sugar. So you could look at a container of yogurt and it might say 11 grams of sugar, but you may not have realized that most of that is just the natural sugar from milk, the natural lactose. So the new food label, which was revised in 2018, did a couple of things. I mean, it changed the font for calories and the serving size, but it also separated added sugars from the total amount of sugars. So you'll see total sugars listed on the food label, so that would include anything that's naturally occurring, like you find in milk and fruit juice and fruits, as well as any added sugars. And those added sugars, those are the ones that we're trying to limit. So all those limits and those recommendations and those targets are based on the amount of added sugars. And that's the number that we want to closely scrutinize as we're going into the grocery store. And what you'll find is when we look at some of these numbers, you realize how quickly they can add up, but I don't want to overwhelm you here. I'm going to show you how to compute sugar density here, but the other thing to keep in mind is when we look at where we're finding sugar in our foods, there's only about 5 key categories where it's really hiding in the most amounts, and I'll share those with you later. So I don't want you to feel that you have to dig through every pasta box and rice box and everything throughout the grocery store to do this simple conversion. But here, what we're looking at, we're going to have to make a comparison here. Okay, so again, let's say I'm concerned about the sugar in my diet. I'm trying to minimize the added sugar. So we're looking at 2 different potential choices here. We've got this Kashi ripe strawberry bar. We've got the Kind bar. So again, I don't have any financial connections to any of these companies. I just picked these at random. They had nice little pictures there and easy to read food labels. But in order to figure out what is the one with the most added sugar, you could easily look at the added sugars here. So we have 10 grams for this particular bar. That's the one serving size versus 4 grams for this particular bar, and that's the serving size. But if you want to take it a step further and figure out, okay, what percent of these calories or what percent of this product is actually added sugar? And that's where you take 10 out of 35. Again, I don't want you to figure you have to go, there's a lot of stress at the supermarket now between wearing a mask. I don't want you adding a calculator to that equation, but 10 out of 35 is a much higher percentage of weight from sugar versus 4 grams out of 40. So if you did the math there, you've got 28% of sugar by weight for this Kashi bar versus 10% for this Kind bar. What that means is that, okay, yeah, we can see very easily that this Kind bar has less added sugar, but substantially less sugar by weight too. And if you wanted a rule of thumb, again, if you wanted to take a closer look at some of these bars and breakfast cereals and things of that nature, a good rule of thumb is trying to keep that target right around 25% or less for those types of foods. So we know what we're aiming for. We know what our daily limits are. We've got some guidelines in terms of what to target for our foods and snacks. But, I'll tell you what, that sugar habit can be tough to kick. So I'm going to give you a couple of things to consider. Again, it's all about gradually reducing your exposure to that sugar. So the first thing, I want to take sugar off the table, all right? We also want to trade those sugar-sweetened beverages. So how quickly they can add up, the Pepsi, the Coke, the Sunkist, as well as regular fruit juices, apple juice, orange juice, cranberry juice. Trade those drinks for water and other lightly sweetened beverages. So these are, I just threw up a few brands here, Hint, LaCroix, and you can make your own water infused with fruit. So I would make that trade because you're trading one very sweetened beverage for one that's a lot less sweetened. Notice what I've omitted here is artificially sweetened beverages. I don't think they're going to help us crave sugar any less, although they're good choices to make if I'm trading high calorie for no calorie. It isn't going to help you move past craving less and less sweet food. So that's something to keep in mind. When you're looking at food labels, just like I showed you in the previous slide, look closely, just make comparisons. Try to choose the product that has the lowest amount of added sugar. Try to compare ounce per ounce to, or serving size per serving size. If we're looking to add flavor to things like oatmeal or breakfast cereal, add fruit instead of table sugar. Look at your spice cabinet for some ideas, cinnamon and nutmeg, or different types of extract like vanilla extract to add flavoring to foods, again, without that added sugar. And then most importantly, again, it's not about giving it up completely. Remember, healthy eating is about finding foods that help us satisfy us from a health and well-being standpoint, both physically and mentally. So when you're enjoying those sweets, make sure you're savoring them. Take a moment to actually realize this tastes delicious. Don't try to wolf down a mini cupcake in just one big bite. All right, so savor these smaller portions when you're choosing these sweets. And then most of all, if we really want to be a detective in the grocery store, I give you 7 key areas where sugar's probably hiding that you need to be mindful of. So we got all of our drinks that are out there, talked about that. We've got yogurts, we've got breakfast cereals, you got granola and fruit bars, you got your pasta sauces, your condiments, as well as your smoothies. Those are the labels that I want you to look closely at, because chances are there are going to be lower sugar options available for you, so you can, again, gradually get less and less. Keep it in perspective. I mean, yes, ketchup does have a lot of added sugar. We realize that. But when we're looking at ketchup in the big picture of the diet, that's the least of our concerns, because we're not dipping ketchup into carrots. We're dipping it into French fries and things like that. So yes, ketchup does have a lot of added sugar, but also be mindful what else you're pairing those food choices with. I think another big one that can really sneak up on a lot of people is the barbecue sauces. So when we look at trying to enjoy a lot of summertime cuisine, cutting back on how much barbecue sauce is being used can go a long way to help you kick that sugar habit or reduce those perpetual cravings for sugar that we can be frustrated with. So again, some ideas for kicking the sugar habit. I'm going to open it up to questions, but sometimes when I talk about sugar, there's always questions that people have. I want to throw them out in advance. So I'm going to basically ask myself these questions that are on the screen. And that is, first one, is brown sugar a better choice than white sugar? And the answer simply is no. When we look at brown sugar, it's basically brown sugar, white sugar with molasses added to it, or a little bit less processed version of white sugar. Still has the same amount of calories, still has very minimal nutrition, so it's not a better choice than the other. Has a different flavor, so yeah, so again, if I'm looking for a different type of sweet flavoring, I would select that, but it doesn't make it nutritionally superior to the other. Another popular question often about sugar types of topics, and is it better to eat honey instead of sugar? So again, the better here would be from a flavor standpoint, but nutritionally, there's no difference. Honey actually can have a little bit more concentrated amount of calories, although it does taste slightly sweeter than regular sugar, but you're doing it just for a flavor perspective. It's not doing you any favors from a nutritional perspective. Another common question is the sugar in fruit better than table sugar? So here's 2 different answers here. When we're talking about fruit juice, I'm going to say no. All right. Now I know fruit juice has added or has naturally occurring vitamins and minerals, and that's fine. But the problem is with fruit juice, it's stripped of the dietary fiber. So you're still getting a tremendous glucose load once it's consumed. And that makes it, just as troublesome to the diet as table sugar. When we're having the sugar in whole fruit or pieces of fruit, we're getting that dietary fiber. And the presence of that dietary fiber means on average, I'm going to absorb about 25 to 30% less of it, because that fiber is going to slow down the absorption of that overall glucose. So in one case, it is better if it's coming from whole fruit, more vitamins, more minerals, but it's coming from fruit juice, no better. Is regular sugar a better choice than high fructose corn syrup? I will say no. Just like we talked about from the initial slide, they're pretty much one and the same. They're both equal components of glucose and fructose. Some slight difference, obviously, a bit higher fructose load in corn syrup, but nutritionally, it's just one over the other. And then lastly, a very popular question is, does sugar cause hyperactivity in kids? And the data says no. Now, there's one study done in the 70s that showed that sugar led to some hyperactivity, but previous studies since have really showed no connection. The idea here is that when kids are exposed to birthday cake, it's making them hyperactive, but really what the research is suggesting is not the actual food itself, it's the other kids, it's the excitement of being around other people, that's what's causing the hyperactivity. And actually they did studies showing that when parents thought they were giving their kids sugar-sweetened beverages, it led their perception of their activity to be skewed. They gave kids sugarless beverages, but told the parents they had sugar in them. Parents rated the behavior as hyperactive, but the kids actually weren't getting any added sugar. So long story short, sugar doesn't make people hyperactive, but again, it does lead to some extra energy, and it can drive future cravings of more sugar. So again, that's why it's important, especially in the younger population, to be really conservative with the amount of sugar in their diets. All right, so looks like we have some questions here. I'm gonna scroll right there to the bottom here. All right, so good question here. The Kind bar had sugar alcohol as an ingredient. What is sugar alcohol? Should we be wary of it in our food? So sugar alcohol is just a different type of sweetener that I didn't talk about. It's metabolized a little bit differently. It's actually metabolized incompletely in the body, and it's also sometimes used as a laxative. So you have to be mindful of it if you see it in sorbitol and xylitol form, but in any other form like erythritol, it seems to be relatively harmless. But again, it's a incompletely metabolized form of sugar, and therefore it gives us a little bit less overall calories. I wouldn't be too worried about it. It is safe, but again, there are some potential side effects. We typically see sugar alcohols and a lot of sugar-free candies too, and then sometimes you'll see a food label and it'll give you the little warning, excess consumption can have a laxative effect. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to the next slide here, and I'll get to the rest of the questions here. I just wanna make sure that everyone knows how to get their wellness credit. So again, anything that you watch here on our website, you just type in the name of the seminars and your badge number and send it to our email address. And then what I'll do in the reply is give you a copy of this presentation. And then just as a reminder, all of our presentations, or the majority of our presentations, some of them I have to edit down a little bit, are going to be on our webpage, the Wellness TV page on the bridge. So I gave the link there too. And then again, if you have nutrition questions that are specific to just you, and you want to talk to me one-on-one, that's a complimentary service we provide to all employees. Even if you're in Gainesville, we can do this via Zoom. It's not a problem at all. And if you prefer to come in person, we have ample room in our classroom. We can do it still paying attention to distancing. All right, so here, let me go back to our questions. Anything else that comes in, please ask. All right, so I eat a lot of Nature Valley Oats and Honey Bar, shows 11 grams of sugar and 11 grams and 23% daily value. It's an excellent question, Tammy. Daily value is what's recommended for a person following a 2,000 calorie a day diet, meaning what chunk of those calories does that particular food contribute towards that daily value. And again, that's just based on 2,000 calories. Many people need less than that. So because it's a little bit less, for some who's need less calories, the percent daily value might be a little bit higher. All right, so question here also about artificial sweeteners. Yes, I think I may have touched on that already in one of those earlier slides. I don't think it really makes us crave less sugar. So yeah, I do think it can hijack our taste buds, for lack of a better term, and research does show that we still tend to crave sweet foods. You know, if we think of anything, when we look at nutrition, and artificial sweeteners in general and added sugars in general, whenever we sweeten something, we're going to want to eat more of it. So when we look at the use of artificial sweeteners leading us to crave less sugar, there really isn't a connection there. And when we look at artificial sweeteners leading us to weight loss, there's not a strong connection there too, because again, when something's sweetened, we want to eat more of it. So whether you use an artificial sweetener or real sugar, if we're trying to manage our weight, we need to look at ways to reduce both of them. Now, I'm not going to say that artificial sweeteners are harmful, and artificial sweeteners do have a place in the diet, especially if we're trying to minimize added sugars, or if we're dealing with individuals with diabetes and we're trying to limit overall added sugar. They do have a place, but I do think they could make you crave additional sugars. So a couple other good questions here. Yes, nutrition counseling is available to spouses, so it's important to make sure everyone is aware of that. This program is worth 10 points, and everything else just like that. So what I'm going to do here is get back on the video here, make sure you guys still see that I'm here. Anytime you have questions, whatever it is, even if it's not a formal nutrition counseling session, send me an email, give me a phone call. I'll be happy to help. We're going to continue to offer these programs throughout the week moving forward. It's going to be June. It's hard to believe. We're going to do them a little less frequently, so we're going to look at doing them Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, but we want to try to offer something different throughout the calendar and kind of add in some additional topics, do some trivia challenges, do some physical activity programs, have a little bit of everything here. So again, we want to make sure that we're getting information that you're looking for. So if you have questions or other ideas for other topics you want our wellness team to explore, send me an email. You can send it right to the wellness website, and we can be sure we can help you out. Again, thank you so very much. I went a little bit over my time, but I thank you for your time here. And again, take care, and we'll see you down the road. Thank you.